Danny Horn. I'm here to talk to you about dangerous toys, and I'm going to start with the Thing Maker, which is a crafts kit that was made by the Mattel Toy Company starting in 1964. If you're not familiar with it, you might know it as Creepy Crawlers, which was the name of their first and most popular kit. I've actually got one here with me, which I am not going to demonstrate for 3 reasons. Number 1, it takes too long. Number 2, it smells really bad. Number 3, I'm afraid of it. But this is how it works. It's a toy that lets you make your own little rubber toys. It starts with this sort of heating unit that plugs into the wall, and then you've got molds with frogs and snakes and spiders and skeletons and what have you. And so what you do is, step 1, you fill up the mold with liquid plastic goop, and then step 2, put that into the heating unit, which heats up and cooks the plastic into solid form. Then you take these little wire tongs, and step 3, pull them out of the heating unit and drop it into a little pan full of water so it cools down. Once it's cool, step 4, use a little prying tool to pry the toy out of the mold, and then what you've got is a little flower or a spider or a cockroach or whatever, which obviously is awesome. It was really popular in the 60s. From 1964 to 1970, Mattel made 14 different kits. And the interesting thing about the Thing Maker is that every single person who played with it says that they burned their fingers on it. Which obviously you would. It's like an exposed metal hot plate that you're just handing to a 10-year-old. The heating unit would get up to 440 degrees Fahrenheit. Even on the sides, it's 160 degrees if you happen to brush your finger up against it, which you inevitably would at some point in the process. So I would like to share with you some of the burn reports that I found. Burns and blisters were a fact of life in the plastic bug business. You simply sprayed the injury with Bactine and hid it from mom so she wouldn't take your Thing Maker away. I burned myself more than a few times and have the scars to show. I cannot believe I played with this toy totally unsupervised. I had this as a kid, burned the shit out of myself. Learned a lot of valuable lessons. And it wasn't just like when it was on, like even afterwards, all you've got is this little pair of wire tongs between you and this broiling hot mechanism. You pull the mold out of the unit, obviously it's still hot, you drop it into the cooling pan, which instantly flashes into steam. Now you got a pan of boiling water to add to the experience. And the instructions don't say like wait 5 minutes, it says when the mold is cool. Pry out the toy. How do I know when the mold is cool? You figure it out, American child. Use trial and error. Now, there were some instructions on a warning on the back of the instructions. I will read them to you now. Caution, avoid prolonged contact of plastic goop and finished frights with lacquered surface to prevent surface damage. Be careful not to get plastic goop on clothes, rugs, etc. This material will stain fabrics, as do many paints, inks, and juices. Use in a well-ventilated area. Now that's 4 sentences worth of caution. 3 of them are about staining fabrics and surfaces. 1 of them is about the smell. 0 of them is about the clear and present danger that you have just handed to a child. So you guys get the point, but there's one more burn report that I have to show you. This is from a 1971 New York Times article about dangerous toys. Sure, you can burn your hand on the Thing Maker, said Mrs. Jerry Jorgensen. My little girl burned herself several times, never seriously. She added that her daughter had a great deal of fun with it. Now you might ask, who is this callous mother, Jerry Jorgensen? Oh, public relations consultant for Mattel. This was the official company response to the New York Times. So, like, yeah, sure, kids just get burned sometimes. So apparently in 1971, it was okay for a toy company to say that out loud and have them print it in the newspaper. Now, I was born in 1971, and I never had anything even remotely like the Thing Maker. I grew up in the 70s, which is full of like seatbelts and childproof caps. So something must have happened between the late 60s and the early 70s that changed the way that Americans thought about children and danger. And that is what I want to talk to you about tonight. I'm going to begin with a brief and frightening history of consumer product safety laws in the United States. Starting with 1902, when they sold cocaine as a toothache medicine, and heroin. You see it says Bayer on that bottle, like Bayer aspirin. Heroin is a Bayer trademark. And they produced it and sold it in little bottles as a cough suppressant. In the early 1900s, they were just starting to develop modern chemistry techniques as well as modern manufacturing and packaging and distribution. But they didn't know what anything did, and they didn't do any pre-market testing. So this stuff would just go out on the market. So here's Dr. Harvey Wiley from the US Department of Agriculture. In 1902, he was very concerned about the preservatives that food companies were putting into their packaged food. And so he was a very smart scientist and real good at publicity. So he created this experiment where he recruited 12 strong young men from the Department of Agriculture, and they promised to eat all of their meals together for a year. And at each meal, one of the dishes would be spiked with one of these preservatives that they were worried about, like, for example, formaldehyde, which they were using at the time as a preservative for milk. Turns out, in a couple of years, who knew? Yeah, they all get sick. And because this was such a publicity-friendly experiment, people really paid attention to it, and it helped to build support for the Pure Food and Drug Law, which they passed in 1906, which, as you can see, cut down on the use of cocaine. We never had a problem with cocaine again. The problem with this law was it didn't affect like elixirs and cure-alls and quack medicine. Like, for example, Radithor, certified radioactive water. For real, actual radium-infused water that they sold from 1918 to 1931 as an energy drink. There was a high-profile death in 1930, rich guy who drank it a lot and died of terrible bone cancer. So they took it off the market in 1931, but that wasn't enough to get anybody to pass a new law. That had to wait for 1937 and elixir sulfanilamide, which caused kidney failure. Like 100 people died. They had to do a nationwide hunt to get the bottles off the shelves. And so then in 1938, they passed the Federal Food, Drugs, and Cosmetics Act, which established a new government agency, the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, so they could take care of this, which was great. 1952, this was a problem. They had developed sweaters made out of this new brushed rayon that was really like soft and comfortable, and people really liked it. If you got anywhere near a spark, it just went up in flames right away. They called them torch sweaters or exploding sweaters. And if you were one of the 100% of people who smoked in 1952, this is going to be a problem for you. So in 1953, they passed the Flammable Fabrics Act, and then in 1960, the Hazardous Substances Labeling Act, which said if you got something dangerous like gasoline or poison, you got to put a label on it so people know what's in it. Great. So none of this had anything to do with toy safety, but starting in the mid-60s, it passed 3 laws that related to toy safety. 1966, the Child Protection Act, 1969, Child Protection and Toy Safety Act, and then 1972, the Consumer Product and Safety Act. Now, you might be wondering, why'd they have to pass 3 laws in 6 years about the same thing? This is the story I will tell you. I'm going to begin with 1913 and the Erector Set. A.C. Gilbert was an engineer who created this really cool building toy called the Erector Set. You could make a lot of really complicated machines and interesting structures. It was very popular, and so then Gilbert went on to produce a whole huge line of different kits and really became kind of a pioneer in child harm. His kits included in 1919 the Gilbert soldering outfit, which gave people a red-hot soldering gun. And then in 1920, the Gilbert glass-blowing kit. The instructions offered hours of fascinating and instructive fun. Like, for example, do you find that when the glass becomes nearly red-hot, it bends easily? American child holding red-hot glass with your bare hands. And then 1950, I swear to you that this is real, the Gilbert Atomic Energy Lab. It came with a real working Geiger counter, a cloud chamber, and then 4 jars of uranium-bearing radioactive ore samples, which kids could test out. There was a warning in the instructions, and it said, after a while, the radiation might wear off on your ore samples, so just write to the Gilbert Company, we'll send you more. A.C. Gilbert wasn't the only person trying to hurt kids in the 50s. There were also satellite jump shoes, which are these terrifying machines. They're these huge springs held between 2 metal plates, and you kind of strap your kid to the top one and you send them outside and play. The box says it's like walking in space, except Earth has gravity, and you are made of tender, breakable child flesh. Also in 1959, I love these. This is Mattel, the Derringer belt buckle gun. It's a little toy gun that you pack with blasting caps and a rubber bullet, and you attach it to your belt buckle. Bad hombres come along, they say, reach for the sky, like they got the drop on you. What are you gonna do? I'll tell you what you do. You push out your stomach, bang! Problem solved. So this is just ridiculous, obviously, and apart from like the obvious insanity of it, like that's blasting caps, like right in the belt buckle area, which is not where you want them. But nobody really paid that much attention until the deadly ducklings of Easter 1965. These were like real little ducks that were killed and stuffed and then sold to people to put into kids' Easter baskets. And it turned out that the duckling skins were contaminated with salmonella and the stuffing had been sprayed with an insecticide. And right after that, people found out about jaquirity beans from the Caribbean, which are these little beans, super toxic. If a kid swallows one, they could die. And folks discovered that the toy companies were using them as the eyes on stuffed animals. So people finding out about both of those around the same time inspired them to pass the Child Protection Act in 1966, which said that it was actually an amendment to the Hazardous Substances Labeling Act, said if you have an item for a child that's made of a hazardous substance, then you're not allowed to do that anymore. So that was great, but like a lot of the toys, like the Thing Maker, like that's not made out of hazardous substances. It's just this inherently dangerous design. So that is not the end of that story at all. A thing that parents were concerned about in the 60s were war toys. There's a big buildup of US troops in Vietnam in 1962 and 63. And the toy companies responded by taking all their old World War II toys and painting them green and then selling them as jungle warfare toys. And parents were kind of understandably concerned that the toy companies were basically just training their kids to go fight and die in Vietnam. So the mid-60s was kind of this era of mom activism, where a whole group of mothers got together and picketed outside the American International Toy Fair every year, protesting war toys. This really picked up steam in 1968 with the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy. So by the end of '68, Sears announced that they just were going to take toy guns completely out of their Christmas catalogs. The trend actually got so bad that in 1969, Hasbro rebranded their signature soldier toy, G.I. Joe, into the Adventures of G.I. Joe. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He went to space, he went under the sea. They didn't get G.I. Joe back into uniform until 1982. Another area of successful mom activism in the 60s was Saturday morning television. Which in 1967 was really dominated by these really cheap Hanna-Barbera action-adventure shows that were really, really stupid and really violent, especially the Herculoids, which we just need to look at for just a second. The Herculoids is an action-adventure drama about a brave family of space barbarians who fight a ceaseless battle to keep their bleak, featureless planet free of culture and technology. Got mom, dad, and the kid, and then sort of this posse of alien space pets. And in every episode, some intruder would come down to their terrible planet, and the Herculoids would kind of stomp into action and just beat the hell out of them until either they died or they ran away. And so in 1968, when they were starting to look at TV violence, they found that actually the Herculoids is one of the most violent shows on television. Somebody needed to put a stop to this, so in 1968, 3 housewives from Newton, Massachusetts got together and formed an organization called Action for Children's Television. Now, for the young people in the audience, housewife is a word that people used to use to describe what we would call women. This is it's the only picture of them that I have from the 60s, and they're surrounded by a gaggle of their kids. Anytime anybody talked about Action for Children's Television, and it was very influential, they always said housewife and they always said mother, which is annoying. But that was actually their hook. Like, that was how they got attention, that it wasn't a political advocacy group. It was just moms who wanted better stuff for their kids. And so one of their big early successes was they got all those Hanna-Barbera action shows off the air. By 1969, all of them were canceled, and the Herculoids was replaced with Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? For folks who know, Scooby-Doo, it's a mystery adventure sitcom about 4 hip teenagers who travel around the country in a van called the Mystery Machine, where they're talking Great Dane Scooby-Doo. And in every episode, they approach some desolate tourist attraction, like an old hotel or a broken down gold mine or an abandoned circus or something. And everywhere they go, they would find a monster, like a ghost or a phantom, which is a kind of ghost, or a vampire, or a mummy, or a snow ghost, which is also a kind of ghost. And at the end of the episode, they would unmask the monster, and it would turn out to be like Uncle Philip or that nice archaeologist that we met. And they're trying to scare everybody away because they're trying to smuggle jewels or start a rival circus or whatever. So in contrast to the chaotic, violent world of the Herculoids, Scooby-Doo offered sort of a rational, comforting world where there's no such thing as monsters. There's just people that you trust who are dressing up as monsters because they're committing a crime and they're planning to murder you. So by the end of the 60s, we got rid of the Herculoids, got rid of the war toys. Everything is probably fine. Okay, maybe not. This is Edward M. Schwartz. He was a product liability lawyer who became a national expert on dangerous toys. And he wrote a book with the amazing title, Toys That Don't Care, which was kind of like the unsafe at any speed for tricycles. Schwartz's way of kind of gaining attention and publicity for the cause was just to pile example on example, like the Etch-a-Sketch, which I'm sure you know is a drawing toy. You sort of twiddle the little knobs to draw pictures in aluminum dust behind a screen. When it was introduced in 1960, the Etch-a-Sketch, it was a plate glass screen instead of plastic. And so if you drop it, then you've got broken glass plus aluminum dust. So there was that, and then the Star Trek rapid-fire tracer gun, which shot a continuous stream of sharp little plastic discs straight into your sister's eye. And then the toy tunnels, which kind of unaccountably were popular in the late 60s. Kids just liked crawling through this tunnel of like incredibly cheap and unbelievably flammable material. But like the Thing Maker, remember the Thing Maker? Totally got a pass in 1968 because it turns out there was other stuff that was worse. Consumer Reports for Christmas 1968 did a big report on electric toys where they tested out the Thing Maker, a bunch of other toys. This is what they found. Thing Maker, as I told you, 440 degrees in the heating unit. Johnny Toy Maker, which is Topper's knockoff version, 550 degrees in the heating unit. So that's the more badass version, obviously. And then the Castrate Metal Cassette Set, 800 degrees in the heating unit, which, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that's how hot it is on the surface of the sun. So finally, they piled up enough examples that in 1969, they passed the Child Protection and Toy Safety Act, which put the FDA in charge of regulating dangerous toys, which is fine. They didn't really do anything. Mostly the FDA just wanted to talk to toy manufacturers and sort of encourage them to do better. Their big success for 1970 was that they persuaded Ohio Art to replace the plate glass screen with plastic. So that was great, but it's kind of the only thing they did. And 1970 is when lawn darts started coming into the public consciousness, also called javelin darts or jarts. It's this outdoor game where you got like these big plastic darts with heavy metal tips, and what you do is you throw it really high into the air, and then it comes down and it crushes the head of your child. Like, those are the rules as I understand them. And so, like, Edward Schwartz and Consumer Reports were saying, like, okay, FDA, we got a new law, like, could you please? And they just didn't. Finally, under pressure from consumer groups, 6 days before Christmas, the FDA banned 4 classes of toys. It was some breakable rattles and dolls, some noisemaker toys, and some cap guns. Except they refused to issue a list of the brand names. And it turned out actually all that they did was just write to the toy companies and say, hey, by the way, these toys are banned now. Thanks, awesome. So it didn't really do a lot. And then 1971, the FDA basically just emitted this series of sad failure noises, which I will show you a couple on the Magic FDA Etch-a-Sketch screen of excuses. This is from May 1971. Complete surveillance of the toy market is prohibitive due to the large size of the toy industry. And then in November, the need for public education is based on the fact that, like most consumer products, toys can never be designed or regulated with absolute safety. So basically, the FDA's attitude was, oh, you guys, there are so many toys. Why don't you do it? So in 1972, they had to pass another law, the Consumer Product and Safety Act, which took taking consumer products like away from the FDA, who could not handle it, took away from the FDA, gave it to the Consumer Product Safety Commission, which was a new agency. that they started who actually got stuff done. CPSC, they banned a whole bunch of dangerous toys as well as other kinds of products. And for Christmas, they released a list of dangerous toys, like they're banned, and they recruited a bunch of volunteers from all 50 states to go around to local toy stores to check toys against the banned list. And if they found any in the store, then they could call a special hotline and the CPSC would take care of it. And it really worked. Like, they got a lot of dangerous stuff out of kids' hands. Like, for example, their own toy safety buttons. In 1974, which they had to recall because it had sharp edges and lead paint and clips that could be broken off and swallowed. I don't know who called that into the hotline. But that is basically like the CPSC in 1973, that is when they started to really get like the 1970s that I remember was sort of the safer world that I grew up in, which is great. But I just want to say a word for a moment about the 1980s and how they ruined everything. Starting with Halloween. I don't know if you remember, Halloween used to be a holiday where kids would dress up in disguises and then just go out and bother their neighbors all night. And when I was growing up, there were always stories of like this dumb kid who got an apple for trick-or-treat and then bit into it like a chump and found like a razor blade in it because somebody wants to kill him. These stories had been around since at least the late 60s, but it never really happened, so nobody really paid that much attention. And then in 1982, an actual bad thing happened, which was the Tylenol poisonings. This was a guy in Chicago bought a bunch of Tylenol and then replaced some of the capsules with cyanide, repackaged it, put it back on the shelves for people to buy. 7 people died, and nobody knew kind of like how it happened or where it came from. They had to recall all the Tylenol products. And the story broke in early October. And so then people had a month to kind of obsess about the idea of what happens if this happens to our kids and they get poisoned on Halloween. And so there was a big panic. Like, a lot of places banned trick-or-treating in 1982. And this is a picture from a New York Times article of a police officer inspecting a bag of candy that somebody brought in because they thought it looked suspicious. No idea what he's looking for. Like I said, this stuff never ever happens, and I'll tell you how I know. If you want to hurt random strangers, the thing that you don't do is stand on your own front porch and then hand poison to a neighborhood child in front of a group of witnesses so that when the kid gets sick, they could just like follow the trail of candy wrappers right back to your door. Like, I'm not trying to give advice to murderers or anything. It's just bad protocol. But once these stories start, it's hard to get them out of people's heads. And then 1983 was when they started to say that the role-playing game Dungeons and Dragons was teaching kids to worship Satan. And then there was this like 10-year panic about this vast imaginary conspiracy of Satan-worshipping child pornography kingpins masquerading as nice little old ladies who ran daycare centers. Total nonsense, but once that got into people's heads, like, that also never goes away. So here's where we are as a civilization. You're worried that your neighbor is just waiting for the harvest festival, for the opportunity to murder your child for no reason other than to be randomly and pointlessly evil. Our kids are safer now, like way safer than they have ever been in history. And we don't feel safer because we stopped trusting other people. Why? I'll tell you why. Because since 1969, we have been teaching kids that the scariest thing in the world is an adult that you thought you could trust. Ladies and gentlemen, this has got to stop. Thank you very much.
Go to nerdnite.com to find a Nerd Night event near you, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for our latest presentation.